Hi, Mike DePung here. Welcome back. I'm really glad you're joining me. And yesterday, I kind of made a promise that I would tell a story. This is a good time of the year to tell stories, especially that have not just made up ones. A lot of people have written ghost stories and those kinds of things, but I like to tell stories that I have some kind of association with personally that I think happened in one way or another. Sometimes maybe memories are skewed, but there's some truth to them. And the ones that I tell, have a pretty high level of truth to me. But the explanations can vary for things, and that's okay. I often, well, I talk to people a lot, and uh, to people who care about spiritual things and who a lot of times have grief about the loss of loved ones. And a lot of times they will ask for signs, and they sometimes ask me to ask their loved ones to provide some kind of signs that they're okay, that they're content, that they're at peace, whatever it might be. And then they get signs and then they try to explain them away. Well, don't ask if you don't want to know, really, or if you're going to explain it away. Accept it. Accept what we can sense that sometimes there are just not logical, rational, scientific explanations for. We don't have to have those. What we have to do is hear what our heart says to us. And our heart connects us directly to spirit essence in everything around us. And there are spirits all around us, and they can help us to understand and know these things. Now, I say all this just as a lead in to what I want to tell a family story. If you've ever heard any, I think a few of my stories have been recorded in the past. My students from the past have heard these stories. Because I used to spend 2 days telling these kinds of tales that are um, that are really great for this time of the year. And I tried to stimulate the interest in my students too for gathering stories from their families. And that's what I would encourage you to do if you're listening to me and making them into meaningful. I'll give you an example after I finish the story of how it could be different. But I want to tell you about my grandmother on my mom's side, my maternal grandmother, uh, who for many years had um, premonitions, had received signs and omens about things. And she was a very religious person. And actually, I don't know how much the religion she was in, which was Nazarene, accepted those sorts of things. But she had them going all the way back to her childhood. And one of the things, I'm going to just focus on one story, and I got to make myself focus here. Um, in the 1930s, in the early 1930s, she started having this recurring dream, and it was pretty frequent. And as it went along through the years, the details kept getting added to it. But the way it started was this. Um, she dreamed that there were all these people just packed behind barbed wire and fences, and they were emaciated. They looked really sad, sorrowful, in despair. In fact, they were so emaciated and physically weak. She knew that in her dreams, she knew that they could do nothing to change anything. And this became a very powerful image to her as she kept having this dream. After a few years, she saw that these people, because of a Star of David over one of the buildings that they were coming out of, she knew that they were Jews. And it was making this really deep impact on her. And then she saw at the outside of the gate of this compound thing, this other symbol that was a strange symbol to her. Now, keep in mind that my grandparents lived in Southeast Missouri in a very rural area. There were places down there that still didn't have electricity until the 1950s, or uh, inside bathrooms. So she hadn't seen any of heard much of anything. Seen it, certainly hadn't seen anything. They didn't have TVs then in the 30s. And what happened was this. She would tell the dreams to her friends in the little town. It was a very small rural town where they lived. And she kept telling them for all these years, but the dreams became so insistent that she wrote several times to the senators of Missouri and to state representatives, and she never got a response. Well, I'm sure that you're aware of now what it's leading up to, but here's what is interesting is that she didn't even know my dad at the time, and my mother and father hadn't met yet. And it wasn't until really at the beginning of the war that they met and married. And then my dad was off for 3.5 years to World War II. Um, so I say that because my grandmother was having these dreams beforehand of a concentration camp, of this Nazi concentration camp, and these Jews who were being exterminated and dying by the millions ultimately. But what was happening as the war continued, got into the midway point and after the war, the film reels were coming back from Europe. And the only way anybody knew here what it was really like, what it looked like from the actual film, was they played it in the local theater, in the local movie house. And down there, where my grandparents lived, there was one theater. Now, my grandmother and grandfather would never go to it because my grandfather was a Nazarene minister, and that was one of the worldly things that you wouldn't do, is go to a movie theater. But my grandmother had spoken so much about what her dream was like and how much more specific it got through the years. And she had written these letters to government representatives. Um, these people, her friends in the town, they all knew one another, that did go to the theater and see the film reels, they came to her one after another the days following. Every time there would be these films would come back of these concentration camps, and they would tell her, Rosa, it's just like you said, this is the dream, this is your dream, we know it is, that's what you. And indeed it was. So for years before the actual onset of the extermination of the Jews by the Nazis, uh, she had these signs in these dream visions, and she knew it was happening. Could she do anything about it? No, except maybe do the kinds of work that I sometimes do, which is to intercede to the spirit with the spirits on their behalf. Um, so she didn't, though. She might have prayed. I'm sure she prayed for them. Um, Now, my let's skip ahead to the end of World War II, and my dad is back home. And uh, years later, after I was born, he would tell stories about all the things that happened in World War II that he experienced. And there was a lot of cool stories and fun stuff about skiing through the Alps, about uh, setting off dynamite in a river to get fish for his platoon to eat. He was a tech sergeant as a combat engineer. And he would tell me about how they would build bridges. His group would build bridges across rivers so that our troops could pass over. And after our troops were finished, he would blow up the bridges so the Germans couldn't use those. So there were all kinds of stories. And one time he mentioned, I was probably about 10 or 12 years old. He mentioned something about, because there had been something on television about the concentration camps. And he said, I was there at one of them. And what happened was I started asking questions like, where was it? Was it this place that we just saw about? And he just sat there staring ahead. And I saw the tears fill up his lower eyelid. And uh, I said, Dad. And he just held his hand up and he said, no more. He wouldn't, that was one thing. He told me all these other amazing stories, but no more. He wouldn't tell me about it. I knew all of his life he had deep resentment towards those that had those kinds of leanings, that Nazi fascist leaning, which means that even though he was a very staunch conservative, there's no way he would be voting for what is the Republican side of things now. Um, so he uh, he stopped that. But what is part of the neat family story to me is my grandmother didn't even know him when she started having the dreams, and he experienced what her dreams were. He saw it in real life. And I just think that's an awesome thing to know and to have in our family history, and to remember that we do have helping spirits all around us. We have those who can intervene and intercede. Um, and maybe it can't be on a big level that could stop something like horrible fascist type movements, but it can help those, it can help us to help others, to help those ones and twos that we might be able to intercede with the spirits, to go on behalf of others. And even for those who pass, who transition, who pass away because of these kinds of things, to be able to um, address them, to communicate with them, to know that they are not forgotten. Just like I speak to my grandmother and my dad and all of my family every day, and hear these things. So uh, I wanted to share that with you. I wanted to share too how this could be a completely different story if you don't take the time to stop and to gather them and to think about them and to keep sharing them through the years so that they take form. Because the story could have been my grandmother used to have dreams about things that might have happened or might not have happened. And she dreamed about the Nazis about 10 years beforehand. And then my dad was in World War II and he fought the Nazis. And that could be the story. It's just not the same because there's richness there. It's part of who we are as a family. It's part of what we experienced as a family. And make that, count that as special, count that as important. So that's kind of a weird thing, a supernatural thing. I have a lot more stories that are like that. And maybe next week I will share some of those. But for now, love and peace and enjoy this time of the year.